Before you step outside today, you probably glance at a screen to see if rain is coming, trusting a vast, invisible infrastructure to keep you dry and safe. But the standardized, nationwide federal weather warnings we rely on every single day did not exist in the United States until 1870. For the first century of the nation's existence, a hurricane or a blizzard was a complete, deadly surprise. How did a rapidly expanding empire protect its fleets and citizens before the government took responsibility for the sky? The answer is a story of fragmented power, eccentric volunteers, and the brutal economic cost of ignorance. Before 1870, predicting the weather was not a public service, but a chaotic mix of folklore, private speculation, and local guesswork. Whoever could guess the arrival of a gale held a massive economic advantage over the shipping lanes and agricultural markets. In the early 19th century, tracking a storm was physically impossible because weather moved faster than human communication. A merchant in New York had no way of knowing a violent gale was tearing through Ohio and heading straight for the eastern seaboard. Instead, citizens relied on printed publications, which offered vague, year-in-advance predictions based on astronomical cycles rather than actual atmospheric data. A farmer's almanac from 1832 provided generalized seasonal forecasts printed alongside planting guides and tide tables. These small paper booklets were consulted like gospel, but they were entirely useless for predicting an imminent, deadly weather event. When the sky darkened, survival depended entirely on reading local wind shifts and animal behavior. At sea, the situation was even more desperate, relying entirely on isolated, localized instruments. A 19th century ship captain consulted a brass marine barometer mounted in his cabin, watching the mercury drop to predict an incoming squall. This physical instrument could only tell him what was happening directly above his own ship, leaving him entirely blind to storms forming just over the horizon. The fundamental architecture of time and space changed forever in 1844 with the commercialization of the telegraph. For the first time in human history, a message could travel faster than a storm front. This technological breakthrough sparked a radical idea among a handful of scientists and telegraph operators. Telegraph operators began casually transmitting their local weather conditions down the wire to the next station to test the lines at the start of their shifts. A daily ledger in a telegraph office might note cloudy and raining in Cincinnati, which an operator in Pittsburgh would read hours before those clouds actually arrived. This accidental network proved that storms moved in predictable patterns from west to east. Seeing this enormous potential, the first secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Joseph Henry, attempted to organize these scattered reports into a cohesive system in 1849. He convinced telegraph companies to allow volunteer observers to transmit weather data to Washington for free. Inside the Smithsonian building, Joseph Henry mounted a large physical map of the United States in the public hall. Each morning, assistants would pin colored discs onto this map to represent the incoming telegraphic reports of clear skies, rain, or snow across different states. For the first time, a centralized visual representation of the nation's weather existed in one single room. However, this early network was entirely voluntary, underfunded, and hopelessly fragile. The observers were unpaid amateurs using uncalibrated, mismatched glass barometers and local thermometers. Furthermore, telegraph companies prioritized paying commercial traffic, meaning vital weather reports were often delayed or discarded entirely during busy hours. Crucially, there was no organized mechanism to broadcast a warning back out to the public, leaving ships and coastal cities completely blind to approaching danger. The federal government still viewed weather as an academic curiosity, not a matter of national security or interstate commerce. It would take a catastrophic loss of life and a massive threat to the American economy to force the government to look up at the sky. As the 19th century progressed, the industrial heart of the United States shifted toward the massive freshwater expanse of the Great Lakes. Thousands of wooden schooners and early steamships transported the grain, timber, and iron ore required to build a rapidly expanding nation. But this vital economic artery was incredibly vulnerable to sudden, violent atmospheric shifts. The Great Lakes were notorious for generating localized, ferocious gales that could form and strike with almost no visual warning. Because the Smithsonian's fragile volunteer network had completely collapsed during the American Civil War, the nation's most important shipping lanes were left entirely unprotected. Navigating these waters remained a deadly gamble against the unpredictable forces of nature. The true cost of this ignorance peaked during the catastrophic shipping seasons of 1868 and 1869. Over those 2 years, nearly 2,000 vessels were wrecked or severely damaged across the lakes by surprise storms. The shattered wooden hulls washing ashore represented not just a staggering loss of human life, but millions of dollars in sunken commercial capital. This localized economic slaughter caught the attention of Increase Lapham, a self-taught scientist and relentless observer living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Lapham understood that these storms usually originated in the west and moved eastward across the lakes. He knew that a functional telegraphic warning system could save hundreds of lives and fortify the regional economy. To force the government's hand, Lapham compiled a devastatingly precise statistical memorial documenting the exact financial destruction of the 1869 shipping season. A handwritten petition detailed a long list of sunken ships, drowned sailors, and destroyed cargo totals. He mailed this grim accounting directly to Wisconsin Congressman Halbert E. Payne, demanding federal intervention. Congressman Payne immediately recognized that Lapham's proposal was not merely a scientific endeavor, but a critical matter of interstate commerce and national defense. However, Payne knew that relying on unpaid civilian volunteers had already failed miserably under the Smithsonian. A truly reliable national warning system required rigid discipline, standardized equipment, and absolute authority over the telegraph lines. There was only one institution in the United States capable of executing this immense logistical operation. Payne drafted legislation to hand the responsibility of weather prediction directly to the United States Army. Specifically, the task would fall to the Army Signal Service, which had already built a vast military telegraph network during the Civil War. On February 9, 1870, Congress passed a joint resolution explicitly authorizing the Secretary of War to take meteorological observations at military stations across the continent. President Ulysses S. Grant signed the one-page legislative act into law, officially creating the first Federal Weather Service. For the first time, predicting a storm became a formalized, funded government duty. The transition from amateur science to military operation was immediate and strictly regulated. The Signal Service deployed disciplined sergeant observers to newly established weather stations stretching from the frontier forts to the eastern seaboard. These soldiers were ordered to take simultaneous atmospheric readings 3 times a day, precisely synchronized by Washington time. A standardized military observation logbook recorded the exact barometric pressure, temperature, and wind direction at each designated hour. Because they were under military orders, the sergeants commandeered priority access on the commercial telegraph wires to transmit these numbers directly to the Capitol. The era of lost reports and delayed warnings officially ended under the threat of court-martial. Inside the War Department in Washington, a specialized group of officers received this coded telegraphic data and rapidly translated it onto a national weather map. By analyzing the pressure gradients and wind shifts, these military meteorologists could finally track a storm system moving across the continent in real time. The crucial final step was broadcasting this life-saving intelligence back out to the vulnerable populations before the storm arrived. The real test of this newly forged military apparatus was not just gathering data, but successfully alerting a populace accustomed to looking only at the horizon. The Signal Service devised a highly visible, low-tech solution to bridge the gap between military intelligence and civilian maritime operations. They implemented a system of physical, cautionary signals displayed directly at the busiest ports and coastal cities. When the Washington office determined a dangerous gale was imminent, a commanding officer authorized a priority telegram known as a warning order. A yellow Western Union telegraph slip arrived at the local station, bearing the direct military command to hoist the storm flags immediately. This physical piece of paper was the first iteration of the modern severe weather alert. Upon receiving this order, the local sergeant rushed to the roof of the tallest building in the port to physically raise the warning. A heavy canvas flag, distinctly designed as a red square with a black center, was hoisted high onto a specialized signal mast. Any ship captain looking through a spyglass across the harbor immediately recognized this stark geometric banner as a government mandate to remain in port. At night, the visual system transitioned to illuminated warnings to ensure the life-saving message was never lost in the dark. A sequence of red lanterns, fueled by whale oil and suspended from the same mast, burned brightly above the docks. The federal government had effectively transformed the abstract science of meteorology into a mandatory visual language of survival. Beyond the coastal ports, the Signal Service needed a way to distribute daily weather bulletins to the inland, rural populations. They partnered with the United States Post Office to display printed forecasts in thousands of agricultural communities. A localized daily weather bulletin, printed on official government stationery, was pinned to the wall of the town post office every single morning. This physical document allowed a landlocked farmer to read the government's official prediction for the first time before hitching his plow. Initially, many veteran sailors and hardened farmers deeply distrusted these new federal warnings, preferring their own traditional instincts. They viewed the Army's telegraphic predictions as arrogant interference from distant bureaucrats who had never worked a ship's rigging. It took several highly publicized, deadly storms, where the government flags proved entirely accurate, to finally break this generational stubbornness. The economic impact of this visual warning system was both immediate and staggering to the maritime industry. During the fall of 1871, the Signal Service successfully predicted and flagged multiple massive storms days before they struck the eastern seaboard. Shipping insurance companies suddenly realized that millions of dollars in cargo were being saved by a few canvas flags and telegraph wires. However, this newfound federal authority over the sky created distinct winners and losers in the American economy. The clear winners were the massive commercial shipping conglomerates and agricultural markets, who could now plan their operations with unprecedented, government-subsidized certainty. The immediate losers were the private, local forecasters and almanac publishers, whose mystical seasonal predictions were instantly rendered obsolete by real-time military data. Yet the military's strict monopoly over weather prediction eventually created profound political friction as the nation modernized. Farmers in the agricultural heartland began demanding specialized rain and frost forecasts, arguing that the Army was too focused on coastal gales and military logistics. They insisted that weather was fundamentally a civilian economic resource, not a theater of war. This growing public pressure ultimately forced Congress to strip the military of its weather duties entirely in 1890. The operation was transferred to the newly created Civilian Weather Bureau under the Department of Agriculture, permanently demilitarizing the nation's forecasts. The disciplined infrastructure built by the Signal Service became the direct foundation for the modern National Weather Service we rely on today. Today, the architecture of American weather prediction remains a quiet battlefield over who controls the sky. The tension between a free, publicly funded government warning system and private companies seeking to monetize specialized forecasts is stronger than ever. The federal government still collects the vast majority of the raw atmospheric data, but private corporations continually lobby to restrict how that life-saving information is distributed to the public. When you check your phone for a rain alert, you are tapping into a hard-won infrastructure born from shipwrecks, military discipline, and the telegraph. The ability to know a storm is coming before it hits is not a natural right, but a deliberately constructed system of federal power. It represents the exact moment the government decided that the atmosphere itself was a matter of national security. Do you believe that all advanced weather forecasting should remain a strictly public, government-funded utility? Or is there a legitimate place for private companies to monetize and withhold the most accurate predictions? Subscribe to the channel to uncover more hidden histories of the systems, laws, and architectures that quietly govern our modern world.